All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a sermon that lays out a really unique blueprint for financial dominion, one that's both spiritual and incredibly practical. The main idea here? That true wealth is about way more than just working hard. Let's see how. So, the whole thing kicks off with this super powerful quote from the book of Proverbs, and wow, it really sets the tone, right? The message is clear. Passivity is the enemy. It's a direct challenge to anyone who just wishes for more, but isn't actually willing to get their hands dirty. This idea becomes the bedrock for everything else we're about to unpack. But here's the twist. While you absolutely have to act, the speaker argues that our whole idea that hard work is the only key to success, well, it's just not the full picture. He poses this problem. If being smart and working hard were all it took, wouldn't the world's wealth be spread out a lot differently? And this gets right to the heart of his argument. Being smart and diligent are great. They're your credentials, but they are not a guarantee of wealth. And why is that? Because, as he points out, the truly wealthy are the ones who hire smart, diligent people to work for them. That suggests there's something else going on, some other factor that separates the person in charge from everyone else. And this is that other factor, empowerment. He defines this as the literal power to get wealth, and he pulls this from Deuteronomy 8:18. So this isn't about your skills or your IQ, it's an ability that he says comes from the spiritual realm. The big takeaway here is that in this framework, you have to tap into this empowerment to achieve true wealth. So the big question is, how do you actually get this spiritual empowerment? Well, the speaker breaks it down into two key components that he calls instructions and mysteries. These are basically the principles and the spiritual laws that make this whole system work. And this comparison just illustrates it perfectly. He draws a really sharp line between two different ways of thinking. You've got the businessman of the world who can play by a different set of rules, cut corners, take bribes, whatever it takes. But the kingdom man can't do that. They're bound by integrity. So to even compete, let alone succeed, they have to lean on a completely different advantage, a spiritual one that comes from understanding these instructions and mysteries. Okay, so that leads us to the first huge pillar of this blueprint. This is the practical side of the coin. And it all starts with something super simple, something you just can't get around: work. The foundational idea is this: you've got to find something to do with your hands. It's a very real, very tangible starting point. The concept is that your work creates a kind of physical vessel, or a channel, that God can then bless. If there's no work, there's nothing to establish, nothing to prosper. You have to give the blessing a place to land. But, and this is a big but, not just any work qualifies. According to the speaker, for your work to be blessed, it has to pass 6 different tests of character. It has to be righteous, done with humility, and you have to treat people with honor. It demands diligence, it must be guided by wisdom, and it has to be supported by what he calls priesthood, which is all about maintaining your own personal spiritual foundation. And to really drive home what he means by diligence, he shares this pretty intense personal story. This quote, "It isn't just about working late. It's about a mindset of constant, relentless training." He basically frames rest as something you earn way later in life, hammering home the point that your building season requires a crazy work ethic. And here's what that early diligence looked like. He tells this story from his early days when he preached with everything he had, just poured all his energy out. Afterward, they gave him an envelope, and what was inside? Just 3,000 naira, barely enough to cover his trip. You can just imagine the frustration, right? It was a real test of his commitment. But then you flash forward a few years. He's been consistently applying these principles, he's honed his craft, and the reward looks, well, a lot different. He speaks for just a couple of sessions, and this time he's given 3 million naira. That contrast is so powerful. It just shows the long-term result of sticking with it and passing those tests, especially diligence, year after year. All right, so we've covered the practical pillar of work. Now we're going to pivot to the second, more spiritual pillar. This is what the speaker calls the giving covenant, and it's basically the engine that he says unlocks supernatural growth. So what even is a covenant in this context? Well, it's described as a promise that is so solid, God himself guarantees it with his own integrity. It's like a spiritual law that works outside of normal economics. And the key, the way you turn this law on, is through the act of giving, which he compares to a farmer sowing a seed to get a harvest. But engaging with this covenant isn't just random. He lays out a really clear path. You start with revelation, which means you first have to really understand the principle from Scripture. Then it gets more personal, where you're prompted to give in specific situations. And finally, it becomes a lifestyle, where giving is just a natural, consistent part of who you are. And within this lifestyle of giving, he gets even more specific. He identifies 5 distinct categories of what he calls honor giving. These are things like regular offerings and tithes, giving the first fruit or the very first portion of any increase, a special in-gathering offering to show thanks, and then special offerings for specific needs or projects. Okay, so let's put all the pieces together. The speaker takes all these different ideas, the work, the 6 tests, the covenant, and combines them into one single cohesive blueprint for achieving what he calls financial dominion. So here you have it, the whole formula in one shot. It starts with pillar 1, work, which creates the vessel for the blessing. Then that work has to be sanctified by passing those 6 tests of character. When that happens, it opens the door to pillar 2, the covenant of giving, which is what unlocks that supernatural increase. And he says all of this has to be built on a solid foundation, a life free from iniquity, because that's what allows God to establish the result and make it last.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. Based on this whole framework, is success just a practical formula that you can follow step by step, or is it really a spiritual mystery that you have to unlock? The speaker's answer seems to be that it's actually both, a powerful fusion of practical discipline and spiritual law. And that is definitely something to chew on.